Hello and welcome to the Combustible Cladding Defects and Risk webinar of CHU. I'm Steve Cheepak, Head of Underwriting, and it's a pleasure to be able to present this topic to you with some esteemed guests as well. Before we get into it, I'd like to start with the acknowledgement of country. You just flick to the next slide, thank you. In the spirit of reconciliation, CHU acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work throughout Australia and their continuing connection to land, sea and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. So thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules, particularly this time of year. But I think it's going to be a ripper, this one. We have two very special guests from Cladding Safety Victoria. And whilst our guests are from a Victorian-based agency, I'm sure you all in attendance will get some learnings from this webinar, regardless of where you're situated. So thank you for all logging on from wherever you might be. Our first guest is Dan O'Brien, Chief Executive at Cladding Safety Victoria. Dan has extensive experience across the public and private sector. Dan was previously the Chief Executive of Incolink, delivering services to Victoria's building and construction industry. He has also held key executive roles of the National Australia Bank and Medibank Private, and senior roles in both the Victorian and federal governments, including Chief Executive of Regional Development Victoria and Deputy Secretary of the Department of Regional Development, Arts and Sports, Federal. Dan was previously the Chief of Staff to former Victorian Premier John Brumby. So welcome, Dan.
Thanks, Steve.
We also have Luke Excel, who fittingly surname fits very well for this because he excels at all things cladding and defects. Luke is the Director for Legal, Commercial and Procurement at Cladding Safety Victoria. Luke led the VBA's cladding audit team following the tragic Grenfell fire in June 2017, implementing the recommendations of the Victorian Cladding Task Force and mobilising a risk-based audit methodology. This work ultimately led to the 2019 landmark announcement of a $600 million government investment in cladding rectification and the creation of a new agency, Cladding Safety Victoria. Luke was part of CSV's founding executive team, which developed and implemented a unique delivery model for rectification works across hundreds of privately owned apartment buildings. Luke led the development of a state-arranged insurance solution for professionals involved in cladding rectification. Luke has previously been the Registrar of the Building Appeals Board and a solicitor. So welcome, Luke.
Thank you.
And finally, our very own Kimberly Johnson, Kim being the CEO of CHU Underwriting Agencies, one of Australia's leading strata insurance specialists. Kim joined the insurance industry in South Australia in 2005. She has worked across multiple jurisdictions and held various underwriting, sales and management roles. Kimberly has a wealth of experience and knowledge of the strata industry and the strata community. In 2017, Kimberly was named Young Insurance Professional of the Year at the Australian Insurance Industry Awards. In addition to being a Fellow of ANZIIF, she is a member of the Australian Institute of Company Directors and holds an MBA from AIM Business School. She also notes her greatest pleasure in working is managing myself. So thank you, Kim.
No, Steve, I said that's most of my time, not the greatest pleasure.
All right, well, I'm doing the intro, so let's run with what I said. Finally, we have Renee Reary, Head of Underwriting Service Delivery, and myself will both be available throughout the webinar to assist with any questions. But the format of this is going to be Dan's going to present a slide deck on behalf of Cladding Safety Victoria. Following that, there'll be some Q&A between CHU and Cladding Safety Victoria representatives, and we look forward to it and hope you all get something out of it. So without further ado, the floor is yours, Dan.
Oh, thanks very much, Stephen. Thanks for the introductions. Very kind. But particular thanks to Kim and for creating this opportunity to speak to you all, and I appreciate everyone who's tuned in. As Stephen mentioned, I'm coming at it from, I suppose, from a Victorian-specific perspective, but I truly believe that the learnings and the approach that we're adopting is universal and can be universal. And in fact, we're speaking with jurisdictions in the UK, Scotland and Ireland, and have been for some time about our approach and working with them. But so today, what I really want to do is give you an insight in terms of the size of the problem, the progress we're making, but also to give you an understanding of how we view cladding risk and I think that's a really important point for everyone on this call, and how we're addressing that risk, but also about some of the things that we're seeing behind the scenes of buildings that I think, quite frankly, pose much more risk than some of the, in many instances, than the actual cladding that's on buildings. So we'll talk about that as well. But firstly, I'm an economist by training, so I like numbers, and these are pretty simple ones. So, except a lot to deal with. So in Victoria, we have identified over 1,500 buildings, almost 1,600 buildings, with some form of combustible material on them. These are Class 2 buildings I'm talking about, Class 2 apartment complexes, so 3 stories and above. And I'll break that down in a moment. So we've got 2 phases of our program. We've got the residential program and we've got the government program. There's been 250 buildings thereabouts assessed having some cladding risk on the government building front. 130 of those was considered to be enough of a risk to address, and we've made fantastic progress making sure that 118 of those are complete, with 10 in construction and 2 in the pre-construction phase. So we've got a good handle on the government side, so I'm not going to talk about that. In fact, that government buildings, all those government buildings should be addressed by March next year, so which should be good to get them off the plate. But back into the more complex area, which involves a lot of insurance issues, which is a private residential. So of the almost 1,600 buildings that we have found, Class 2 buildings, we've identified 365 at this point have entered into some type of funding agreement with the state. With 282 of those, 365, works are completed. So that risk is completely retired. We've got works underway or in design of another 83. And there's another probably about 80 buildings that are a bit less than that will join that group of buildings where works will be undertaken. And we focus on works where we see the risk is unacceptable. The risk posed by the combustible clad have been unacceptable, and I'm going to get to that in a bit. Now, there's a whole range of other buildings where we have looked at and we have discharged from the program. They've become out of scope. The vast majority of those is because the cladding risk, the cladding type on the building isn't as risky as first thought, or is a non-combustible product, and that's based on testing and further exploration. So they were suspected as having a combustible product on them, but in most instances, the buildings have been discharged because they are particularly low risk or no risk. So there's 391 in that category at the moment, and that category is going as we do more testing. Now, there's another 837 buildings which we have rated each and every one of them at an initial scan, and we've rated them according to our risk criteria, which I'll get onto. 65 of them are unacceptable, 348 we call elevated risk, and 389 at this point in time are low-rated risk, with 35 further under review. The low-rated buildings, when we get agreement with the municipal building surveyors at a local government level, they'll join the discharge category. And we're making good progress on going through that. And these are buildings where in Victoria, we have a ministerial guideline that enables us to look at buildings by virtue of risk, the risk that the cladding poses on those particular buildings. And that's an important step in Victoria, because we're not trying to achieve National Construction Code compliance many years after a building is built. We're trying to reduce the risk on the building, the risk posed by the combustible cladding. Now,
and sorry, Dan, when you say risk, you're talking about risk to human life, aren't you?
Yeah, we'll get it. That's exactly right, Kim. It's risk to human life, but it's also risk to building. So what we're trying to do is limit the amount of exposure that building may have to a cladding-related flame, a cladding-related fire. So that's a really big and important part of it. If a building gets engulfed, but still people can get out, that's not success. So we're trying to reduce both risk to human life, but also risk to building damage, which I think is important from an insurance perspective. Now, let's go back a step. What are we talking about? We're talking about different types of cladding on different types of buildings, right? And in Victoria, we have, and I think this is a really important takeout from here, we have identified more buildings with different types of combustible material on them than anywhere in the world. And that's because we've not looked just at the tall buildings where there's a vertical run of ACP polyethylene. In this picture here, you'll see that. And this type of building configuration, it's sort of featured in the Neo fire in Melbourne and also the lacrosse fire, where there was a fin of combustible material racing up the side of the building, and balconies were exposed. And in fact, the fire started on the balconies and raced up the outside. Now that's, when I first joined this program, that's what I thought I'd be dealing with the vast majority of the time. And in fact, we've gone onto those very, very quickly to make sure we've been addressing those types of buildings. A genuine unacceptable risk on these buildings, 100%. More often, in terms of the fleet of buildings we're looking at, it looks like this, right? This is a 4-story building with expanded polystyrene. Right, expanded polystyrene is around about 10 centimetres in thickness, and it's just like an esky foam. And for those that haven't seen it, it is concrete rendered, and that's got about 10 or 12 mil of concrete render that'll be over the top of that. Here we've delaminated that concrete render, and we've exposed the EPS, and you'll see at the bottom there the EPS extending to the balustrades there, right? So there's a fair bit of risk on that particular building, and this building would be replaced with a product called, the EPS would be replaced with a product called Hebel, which is sort of a concrete-based product, and the balustrade probably would be replaced with a cement fibre sheeting, so a CFC sheeting, again, in non-combustible materials. So the 4-story buildings and this type of building here, at the top, you'll see a mix. It's a 3-story building. It's a 3-story building with a mix of ACP, PE with a polyethylene core, and expanded polystyrene. And so this building, it would be no more than 9 metres in height. I want you to keep that in mind, because nowhere else in the world are people focused on buildings below 11 metres, right? And yet this type of building here would represent about 40% of the fleet of buildings I'm looking at. Okay, so in Victoria, we've set the bar, we've had a low risk appetite to keep this product in the built environment. And we've looked at different types of products, whereas in other jurisdictions, they've really focused on ACP, PE, polyethylene core, where the building is 18 metres and above. And I'll show you that in a moment, what that looks like. So what are we looking at? Just this is a bit of a look at the different types of buildings that we've got, around the world. You look up cladding fires on YouTube, and you'll see some, it's ongoing, horrific, escalating fires. And of course, we've had the fires in Melbourne that I've spoken about. That's the Neo building. So that's a 42-story building. You can see that going up, that sort of vertical fin area, and it went up very, very rapidly. Fair bit of building damage, not fortunately no loss of human life or injury, which was fortunate. And the same with the lacrosse fire in Melbourne, which is as the crow flies, it would only be 200 metres or 300 metres away. Now we've seen the other buildings in Shanghai with the 2010. I could put up a whole bit of other photos as well. Of course, the tragedy. The terrible tragedy in London in 2017. But if we look at the types of buildings that the rest of the world's focused on, it's not the buildings that we've got in the problem set in Victoria. And it's a really important point. because they've established a sort of de facto risk threshold to say those buildings aren't as risky because you can get out, right? Because first responders can get there and put the fire out quickly. Much easier to actually deal with those types of buildings. But in Victoria, the risk appetite has been set a lot lower. And so if you look at the bottom there, 49.4% of the buildings I'm dealing with are 3-storey, 24% are 4-storey, 8.3% are 5-storey. So really, the buildings that the rest of the world's focused on are 6 stories and above. So that would represent around about 18.3% of what I'm looking at. So in other words, a fairly different initial risk appetite in Victoria that has led to the rise of this agency to get on and help owners get the material, get the risk reduced. But it's because of this problem. It wasn't because of this sort of, I suppose, cohort of buildings that we're dealing with. It was important not just to adopt it must come off at all occasions approach, right? That's the 100% correct solution when you've got a vertical run of polyethylene, all right, across multiple stories. It isn't typically the type of buildings that we're dealing with. We're dealing with buildings with setbacks. We're dealing with buildings with got clusters of cladding, combustible cladding in certain spots. Sometimes where the cladding sits, it poses no risk whatsoever. There's no way they could ignite. And we've done a lot of work to work out how to mitigate that particular risk with different types of interventions. And we'll get onto that now. But just to give you a sense of perspective, if you look at this chart, this is across jurisdictions. You can see Victoria is dealing with a hell of a lot of buildings compared to other jurisdictions. The UK has, this is a bit out of date, the UK is now looking at buildings between 11 metres and 18 metres, but they're looking to adopt a risk-based approach for them. Prior to that, they were focused only on the 18 metres and above. And in the UK, in Scotland, the same. So most of these jurisdictions are focused on those types of, those taller buildings or have a smaller problem set because they haven't looked for expanded polystyrene. Right, in Victoria we've looked at both products as being potentially risky. And so
and I can't believe to see that amount of expanded polystyrene on a residential building, if low rise. It's absolutely amazing that that's sort of one of the things that you've found. Now there's been a question come through, and I wondered if you wouldn't mind answering from the Victorian perspective.
Yeah.
Kieran Conroy has asked, who bears the cost for the remediation, and is the government helping in any way? And so I appreciate your answering from a Victorian government perspective.
Yeah. So from a Victorian government's perspective, back in the end of 2019, they put $600 million towards this issue. But importantly, they put a levy in place, which is a cladding levy. It's based on the building permit, which we collect and we use that to actually directly invest in the removal of the cladding. Where they're deemed high risk, where they're not deemed high risk, where there's the unacceptable risk, then it's our role to provide advice to owners as to how to mitigate that risk. So it has been a direct investment, and that's why we've got so many. I think we've made such great progress getting the cladding off. Quite frankly, I mean, it's not something that owners like to do, to put their hand in the pocket to fund the removal of this risk. But in Victoria, we have, and I think it's yielded some significant dividends in terms of risk reduction. Yeah,
I mean, I'm aware of a building in one of the other states, just a reasonably high-rise building, maybe it's 20 stories, and their cladding bill to remove some fairly severe cladding, but obviously outside of this scheme, was $14 million. And so that was obviously, quite the special levy that those owners had to raise, and it was a really huge decision for them.
Yeah, it's a huge decision, right? Hugely positive. Often means particularly in these 3 and 4 story buildings in the outer suburbs. It means some owners have negative equity, right? If they have to fund it directly, it's a considerable cost. We've been able to use our approach to be able to mobilise builders, get the approach overseen by a clerk of works program to make sure the quality is good. We've been able to control all that because it's not difficult work, but it can be tricky, and you're always interfacing with live buildings, right? People aren't leaving these buildings except in a rare instance. And so we're dealing with live buildings, and it's messy work, particularly with the removal of expanded polystyrene. It gets really, really messy. And the tall towers are tricky. You know, we've got people in dangerous situations removing this stuff. You know, they're working off ropes. It's not something you want to do, really, as a builder. And it's very difficult after the event to be able to deal with this stuff. But we've made great progress, and we'll have all of that sort of cladding works retired by the end of 2025. So we're going well. But the complexity in this program doesn't start and stop with the removal of cladding. It's to understand what is risk. And so and we realised this really early on, we had to actually develop the science around risk, cladding risk. And so we brought on board CSIRO's Data 61 team, and we partnered with RMIT to develop a framework and work out what's the best way of looking at this particular problem, breaking it down bit by bit. And we decided to use a standard risk engineering process, and we had this internationally peer reviewed by fire engineers. But essentially, it's threat barrier analysis. All right, we're working out what are the hazards. How do you prevent those hazards from occurring? So in a cladding-related fire, you see the hazards around ground fire, so emissions from ground source. Balconies, as we've seen in Victoria, there's been a couple of key balcony fires that I've mentioned. Most of the fires are started internally, right? 97% of fires on a building are inside the building, not outside, they're inside the building. Gets to the value of sprinklers. So anyone on this call, a building that is sprinklered is a far, far, far safer building, right? Very important to remember. So hazard is an internal fire. And we've also looked at it could be a little bit mythical, but I think it's important to look at the potential for an electrical fault and inappropriate penetrations in a building, allowing the fire to spread from inside to outside or vice versa. So you look at those hazards, and we worked out, well, what other preventative barriers you could apply, and what is the evidence to say they would work? Now, there's a lot of fire engineering that we've had the opportunity to digest. We've got probably, through our program, about 500 fire engineering reports on 500 different buildings. We've looked at and distilled all those. We've looked at the international evidence, particularly the good stuff that comes out of the US around the nature, the type of fires in apartment buildings, and we've been able to build the evidence about what are the potential values of certain interventions. And as you look at it and you realise that some of these interventions are probably just as important as the removal of cladding, and a lot less expensive. And so we look at developing a set of interventions that looks at putting in preventative barriers, and where a fire might occur, how you get your recovery barriers in, how you can get people out and buildings protected quickly, get the first responders there. And this is a pretty standard paradigm in hazardous waste industries, right? This risk engineering approach. And we've just applied that thinking really to the domestic situation of the existing built environment. And the 15 preventative and recovery barriers, as I say, on the right-hand side of this slide, they give you a good sense of what types of interventions that you could introduce. Sometimes it involves removal of cladding, other times it doesn't. They're all options you can look at It does say that not every piece of combustible material needs to come off. And it does say that you don't necessarily need to achieve NCC compliance 15 years after the building's been constructed to reduce the risk, right? Risk can be reduced by paying attention to the specifics of the building and looking at the types of interventions that you can apply. So we've got a range of types of cladding removal or overcladding. We've got how you use the active fire safety systems and passive fire safety system upgrades that are really, really important, as well as protecting the exit and egress paths. These are all important, and these are backed by science, right? The evidence is there about the values of these interventions. We're getting to the point where we can actually create a cladding risk calculator. If you introduce these interventions, how much cladding risk do you actually reduce? And that work is ongoing, but we're there. This is in principle how we're applying it. And this framework here on a page is being codified in a ministerial guideline. So now a municipal building surveyor, the local government regulator, can have regard to the work of Cladding Safety Victoria, but also of how you reduce risk in a building, right? It gives them guidance about how to deal with things. This is the work that we're sharing with other jurisdictions around the world. And there's a lot of work and evidence and science behind this. I'm not going to go into today, Kim, but it's heavy stuff, and I'm pretty proud of it.
It's incredibly interesting, though. I think the work that's been done as far as, you know, this classification of risk, looking across jurisdictions and also looking across frameworks that might not have necessarily previously been applied to residential buildings and that sort of thinking. I think one of the things that kind of stands out for me, and I'm wondering if you were surprised by this, is how, despite having an issue, which is one thing, cladding in residential strata buildings in Victoria, how much you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach for these issues, and that there's so much depending on the type of cladding, where it is, where the building is, the height of the building. Have you had any surprises through your work on this?
What surprised me, Kim, is that you actually start at the premise that no two buildings are the same, but then you realise as you look at them closely and you categorise buildings that they fit into certain cohorts, right? There's not too many builders build bespoke, right? They keep repeating the same designs, and they keep on using, particularly through a period of time, and I'm talking sort of post-2000 to 2015 in particular, there was a particular type of building methodology that was occurring in Victoria, and I suspect elsewhere in the country. And so many of the buildings, like this one I've got up on the screen, that's pretty similar. We'll see many, many buildings like this, which will have different elevations of combustible material. This has got, this is an EPS building. And so it's a live building, and we're working on a solution for it now. So the EPS building, and it's got certain setbacks, certain exposures on balconies, and yeah, that's pretty common. Now, inside a building and how a building's been built, that's slightly different, right? Because once you get inside the building, you see, geez, where's the fire separation? Where are what's going on with some of the other defects and so forth? So there's a difference from a presentational perspective from the external. There's a lot of similarities. Once you get inside, there can be some differences that we need to have regard to.
We've had a couple of good questions raised in the chat, which I'd like to address verbally, if that's all right. The first was from Connie Yang. It's actually directed probably more towards CHU, but I'm happy for input from anyone. What if the CSV deems a building as a low risk and no need for removal, but CHU requires removal as it's still a non-compliant material? Should CHU accept CSV's assessment in this case and don't require removal? And on a similar vein, there's a question from Jim Merrilees. Hopefully I've pronounced that correctly. If the Triple C is not achieved, how does that affect buildings' insurability? So in answer to that, we can only comment, we can't answer that question on behalf of the insurance industry as a whole, only in terms of our underwriting appetite. So there's one, what I think common misconception I want to put to bed, hopefully on this webinar. We often have strata managers or brokers come to us and say, what do we need to do with our cladding? We can't tell you what you need to do with your cladding. We are not qualified to tell you what to do with your cladding. We are qualified to underwrite the risk based on the nature of the cladding and based on experts' advice. So what we ask for is expert advice on what needs to happen in terms of cladding, and therefore we will rely on those recommendations. So in a perfect world, would you like NCCC compliance? Of course you would. However, insurance is based, and insurance contract law is based on the expectation of what a reasonable person would do with information. And I think it's reasonable to assume that if a statutory body, whether that's a government body in CSV or something similar in another state, puts in writing to the owner's court that no further work is required, I think that a reasonable person would be expected to think no further work is required. So in that sense, I don't think CHU would be following the owners up or tell owners up or telling them what to do. We would just accept that from a risk analysis. We'd still have to apply our premiums at the fact that cladding is still there. But a reasonable person with something in writing from a statutory body, I don't think we're going to overrule that. And we are not looking to overrule anything. We are looking for someone suitably qualified to tell us what the exposure is. Now, CSV, I rattled off a myriad of different qualifications and so on, and all their experience before. If they're prepared to put in writing that no further action is required, that's good enough for us from not pursuing the owners any further for remediating. We will still follow our rating matrices and that for the presence of cladding, however.
The only thing I would probably add to that, Steve, is I cannot imagine a situation where a building would be in such a state that CHU is saying, oh, you've got an order that says this should be removed. It's probably polyethylene, it's probably high rise. I can't imagine that in the context of what Cladding Safety Victoria are doing, that there would be too many instances where we would actually disagree on the course of action. For those really high risk ones, and they seem to be the ones where you'd be following up any kind of remediation of the building, and it's because those recommendations are already in place, we're not making them.
Thanks, Kim and Steve. Now, I'll just sort of quickly go through this standard building and what our approach would be on it. Looking at this building, there's cladding. Every shaded area has got it's got an expanded polystyrene on it. Again, concrete rendered. But you'll see that there's different types of clusters. I've numbered them. So down there to the right, there's a 1, 2, 3. That's in the red. We can see that there is a potential flame spread of 3 buildings, 3 apartments there, 3 apartments. You go further up to the right, and there's a potential flame spread between 2 apartments, but it's disconnected from the apartments below. And over to the side, there's other elevations where there are potential cladding and ignition risks. So on this building, we're not talking about removing all the cladding, but we're talking about removing the cladding that has potential risk greater than 3 and greater, really, because we've got a non-sprinkler building. We take extra care about what we're doing with this building in terms of the potential spread. So we remove all ignition sources, everything off the ground floor, and everything where there is a spread of more than 2. The horizontal spreads, the 1 and 2 up the right-hand corner, we're not as concerned by, because fire, quite frankly, doesn't spread horizontally, and there's no ignition source that's directly associated with those particular apartments. So we do look at the configuration of where the cladding is, and we work through. We add further protections in terms of alarms and smoke detectors to make sure that everything is wired up and ready to go to first responders if any material's left on. And so we pay particular attention to essential safety measures. But in other instances, this is an opportunity not to remove everything, but to remove cladding selectively. And again, we're talking about buildings that are below 11 metres here, right? So again, other parts of the world aren't thinking about these, but these buildings have been contacted by us. We're working with them. And importantly in our process, we work with the local government regulator and the Victorian Building Authority to say, do we all agree? Do we all agree that this is okay? That's pretty hard to get because everyone's risk averse. But once you've got that, it means the state is saying, and local government, all the regulators are concerned that it's okay. And that's the importance of what Steve was talking about before. Where we get that point of agreement, I believe that that it should stand, and the owners will have that effectively on their title forever. We'll give them the advice and that particular rating, working through it building by building. Now, I'm going to just change gears a little bit because here's an interesting one. All right, this is an interesting one. I'm going to get Luke to talk to this in a tick. But one of the things we found when we started this, and it was a confused and emotive state, right? A lot of concern about cladding risk, and rightly so. But when you have a sort of an issue like that, it's really, really important to break it down bit by bit rather than conflate a problem. What we found, even within the state of Victoria, as well as building practitioners, there was confusion about what to do with material that had a fire retardant in it. It was ACP, it had some polyethylene in it, but it had a key fire retardant ingredient. And so we've done a lot of work offline through testing labs to work out just how risky some of these products are. And that keeps going and it keeps informing our thinking. But one of the things we do know is that ACP-FR, so that with a fire retardant in it, not just a low polyethylene count, but a fire retardant has to have an active ingredient in it. An active, it has to be made up with a key fire retardant in it. It's still combustible, so it doesn't meet a particular definition of non-combustible material on an external wall, but it only burns in on itself. It doesn't lead to fire spread. And that's an important thing because we would say, and we would argue, and we are arguing, that that material, particularly where it's an attachment, informs an attachment only, which means it's probably compliant under the NCC originally. Nothing needs to happen. And we would rate it as low. So here we've got an 11-storey building. You can see it up the back, but the only sort of material of concern was what's at the front, which has been outlined in red there. That is an ACP-FR product. It's basically attached to concrete. It's not forming part of the true external wall. We see that as a low risk. Move on to the next building. And so that's a particularly important point. Luke, I might hand over to you.
Thanks, Dan. And thanks very much, everyone, for attending today. It's great to have the opportunity to tell you about our work and the Victorian Government's approach to addressing cladding. Just a couple of concepts I wanted to cover back off on with respect to some of the conversation we've had so far. And there's been some fantastic questions in the chat about this. There's been questions about compliance and risk. There's been discussions about PE or polyethylene and FR. There's been discussions about combustibility and non-combustibility. And there's been discussions about attachments in cladding. I'm just going to go through some of those very quickly because they all relate to the building that's on the screen at the moment. I'll just go through a couple of items from this building's history, though, first, and then we'll return to those concepts because it'll illuminate why we chose this as a case study. The Owners Corporation for this building hired an independent building surveyor compliance consultant, a very experienced building surveyor, because they noticed that they were having some significant premium increases as a result of cladding. In 2021, their premium went up by 10%. In 2022, their premium went up by 10%. In 2023, their premium went up by 15%, and at this stage was at a total of $14,000 a year, with a $2,000 excess having increased from $1,000. The Owners Corporation sought the assistance of the building surveyor compliance consultant and the local municipal building surveyor, the local council, in their argument with the insurer that the insurer should reduce the amount of the premium because of the low risk of the cladding. There was a minor reduction, but on the OC's request for further reduction, they submitted an audit document. So a document that was a very high level triage document about the cladding. It was not a detailed document. Following their submission of that document, the premium went up by $10,000 with a fire damage excess of $10,000 and a request by the insurer that the owners now prepare either a fire engineer's report about the compliance of the cladding or a statement by the fire engineer that the risk was reduced to an acceptable level. Alternatively, the insurer said the owners should replace it all. Now, our knowledge of this building, particularly that purple cladding on the building, is that A, it is an attachment. So it is not a critical element of the external wall makeup, which would be a cladding. So first of all, it's an attachment.
Hey, Luke,
Yeah,
someone in the chat has actually asked to define an attachment. It might be a good time to do that. Versus,
absolutely.
So the question is define an attachment versus cladding.
Sure. The attachment, the reason why the purple is an attachment rather than a cladding is because it is not integral to the makeup of the external wall. If you take that purple cladding off the building, you still have a wall system.
Concrete.
That's right. And if you look at the dividers between the balconies, that's concrete. That concrete that is then returned around the glass sliding doors in the balcony there, that concrete is part of the external wall. If you remove the concrete, you don't have an external wall anymore. That's how you know that it's part of the external wall. The ABCB says that there's about 6 or 7 key components to an external wall system, from the internal lining all the way through the insulation and the sarking and the stud work out to the external cladding. In this case, though, you've got purple attachments to the building. So it's not actually a cladding. That's one step to make. Second step is that this particular purple attachment contains an FR, or a fire retardant. It contains an active ingredient that will suppress the spread of fire. An attachment is considered compliant when a fire on the attachment will not prejudice the use of an exit on the building. In this case, we know there are sprinklers around every balcony and around every exit. So we've got a low-rise building with a low combustible attachment that won't spread fire, with sprinklers around every exit and entrance and on the balconies. The municipal building surveyor has confirmed that no action was required. A CSV building surveyor consultant has now confirmed that there is no action required. But the Owners Corporation has had this request for a fire engineer's report with respect to the compliance or risk of the building, notwithstanding all of the factors that have been pointed out today. There was subsequently a request for another investigation report, and then there was a reverted request back to an FER report, so a fire engineer's report. And the reason we're pointing this out today is because we think for these hundreds of owners of buildings, for elevated or low risk categories of buildings where we don't think that that product needs to be removed, this experience of being given the runaround between experts and surveyors, insurers, and new experts is not an ideal situation for the community to endure. We are saying that we think that the experience for the consumer needs to be improved. I've just noted a comment there from Deb. I'll just look at that there because it looked flammable. So we've got some concerns going on that merely the appearance of combustibility is enough to warrant the increase of premiums. It's our position that given this building is now an older building, Given this building is now 10 plus years old, we need to look at this in a pragmatic way. And the pragmatic way of looking at this building is not about the compliance of the building with the original building code, although I would suggest this building is actually compliant. It's not about the original compliance of the documentation. It's about the risk that this building presents today, both from a life safety and a building report. Okay.
I think I might just take an opportunity to respond there. So I think I can see some questions in the chat. I think it's very important to say CHU, we know very well what we do in our company, but we can't respond on behalf of the entire insurance industry. And we also, what I would say is my experience between strata specialists even with this cladding discussion is that the approach will be quite different depending on the discussions they've had with their underwriters. And so even it wouldn't even be appropriate to try and surmise what others do. But I would say I appreciate that this prevalence and focus on cladding has created work for owners. It's created work for strata managers, work for brokers in trying to ascertain what is it actually on the outside of this building. And there's been a lot of instances where it can be really difficult to get that information. Do I like the idea of someone saying that looks like it's got cladding on it? No, not really. There should be reports in place at this time. We're further enough down this road that people typically know what is on the outside of their building. Now, one thing I would say, and I do just want to clarify this, regardless of whether a PE is a higher risk than an FR, and then you've got an FR in a low rise, it's still not quite as good as just concrete. And so the premium will not match concrete. But it doesn't mean you throw the book at them. And I would say, Luke, and you're probably not going to love this response, when you've talked about the premium increases that building had prior to that their issue with cladding, I would say that those increases are incredibly reasonable in the market that we have seen in strata and general insurance in Australia in the last few years, because we have been hit with catastrophes. We got hit with COVID and lack of, we had claims inflation at 17% at one point. And as a result of all of these things, reinsurance costs actually increased substantially. And so that building, I probably don't like everything that I heard after they start having their cladding discussion, but those prior numbers and excesses are, I would say, are probably on the more palatable end of rate movement that we've seen in strata insurance in Australia in the last few years.
Yeah, and Kim, I think part of the issue is the communication of what's actually driving premium increases. I think there's probably an element that can be refined there, because if it's not cladding and the other issues, so be it. You know, that's the market, and that's what you've got to deal with. But I think a lot of the times the owners are getting left with a very strong impression that it's all as a result of the combustible cladding, which, if it is, and there's issues around that, we're seeking to have those discussions with the industry. And I say CHU has been fantastic in terms of having those discussions, and really appreciate that.
Thank you. I think we've really tried to communicate the reason for premium change to the market. We've done 2 webinars of this style this year on talking about all the building blocks of premiums and the things that go into and can affect insurance premium before you even look at a building.
Yeah.
Which has been very, very strong in the last few years. But I think I'd also just take this opportunity to say 2024 is going to look nicer than 2023 did.
Yeah, good. Hey, and just to finish off at that point, I think one of the issues around cladding is that there's been a lot of mystery. There's been a lot of uncertainty, and there's been a lot of emotion. And there is a way to work through it. And I think as long as we're methodical and consistent, the cladding issue certainly Victoria will be sold by the end of 2015. 2025. Oh, I'm going backwards then. 2025. And I'm going to put that aside because I just want to change gears, because there are other issues beyond cladding, and this presentation is also about some of the defects, which we'll only spend a little bit of time on, but it's important to acknowledge. I mean, the program, because we're taking off so much of the external wall, the external skin, it's like probably the most, and to that extent, we've taken off around about 12 mcg's worth of combustible material. Right, that's for those that like word pictures. So that's what we've done, and that's increasing. But that means we've had an opportunity.
12 mcg's worth of combustible cladding.
Yeah,
that must make you feel better and sleep better at night.
It's certainly better than when I started, I can tell
Probably.
you. Yeah, so we've got a huge amount off, and that means a huge amount of buildings have been de-skinned, and you can look what's behind the skin. It's like a forensic autopsy of a building, and it's not pretty. And 50% of the times the buildings we've dealt with have had substantial non-cladding related defects. And the ones that trouble me the most are around the water ingress that really erodes the integrity of the structure. And so we've got, and we've published this before, we've published it on our website, we'll continue to do it. We've got water ingress issues leading to leaking balconies and structural deficiencies on balconies, so they're unstable. With balustrades that wobble, that with just a little bit of human weight against them would collapse. And I'm surprised not more of this has occurred. And I think this is probably one of the more significant issues in the industry at the moment, or in the built environment, that needs to be dealt with. It's the nature of these, the nature of water ingress in buildings ruining the substrates, rotting the substrates and impacting the structural integrity of the building, particularly the tie-ins. So when the balcony comes into the buildings in a timber frame situation, I'm not talking about the concrete balconies here, I'm talking about the timber frame walk-ups that we've been dealing a lot with. That many of them, are sort of between 15 and 5 years old where these problems start getting created, right? But it's substantial, and it's something that we've been concerned about and reporting up. Not to mention the mould that sits within buildings as a result of that water ingress. And that's also been significant. We've just published a little report or circulating a report across government about the extent of that in the program. I won't go through these stats, but you've got 50% of all the buildings we've dealt with today had defects. 50% of those have got dodgy balconies. Most of it's due to water ingress, and 64% of them are just over the 10-year mark, 10 years or more. Now, this is a bit of an example, a picture horror show here. So it looks okay. If you look at the top picture from the outside, you can take a picture of that, and you started to take this cladding off, and it was a horror show, right? And what was even more frightening than that is that there were for sale signs all over this front area at the time we got there, and they were continuing to sell apartments, right? Now, as we took it off and took more off it, this building is now the slowest building in our program. The owners have to come to the party to fix these defects and fund them. And it'll probably be the last building we finish off. But it's not alone. It might be the most exaggerated example of what we've got, but it's not alone, right? And that's probably the story. I'm just going to play a little video about what we're seeing.
We're finding things, defects, non-compliant works, issues relating to elements such as external weatherproofing, waterproofing, and roofing, particularly the flashing detailing. There's issues with the steel, timber, and reinforced concrete structures. We're finding non-compliant service installations, inadequate or entirely missing fire rating and fire compartmentalisation, inadequate protection and pest proofing of the building. We're finding non-compliant stormwater and plumbing installations, inadequate cross falls and falls away from the internal spaces to the external wet areas, severe and widespread mould and rot ingress issues, incorrectly installed and engineered balustrades, and pre-existing leaks from various sources.
So Kim, that's just an example. I've got the long version of that, but I won't play.
Yeah, no, genuinely, I believe you. So one of the things that CHU, we have always in strata seen buildings with defects, but I think nearly half of the buildings, strata title buildings in Australia, have been built in the last 20 years. And I think what we have seen is a prevalence of building defects through that building period. In New South Wales, we've seen the appointment of the Building Commissioner, David Chandler. He's about to receive new powers. But certainly the quality of buildings that we see, that some of those newer buildings can be really poor. Some little stats. Half the buildings that we have on risk that have the defects flag, yes, are in Victoria. Probably the rest of them are in New South Wales. But actually, for the people on the call, probably about 80% of the buildings with defects that we actually do new business quotes for are in New South Wales. So it's really high prevalence in New South Wales, and that's issues around the code and private certifiers, which are all being addressed. And I think bringing it all back together, we know there's a lot of work to be done around defects, and it's, as you're alluding to, it's a lot scarier than any of the things we're seeing with fire safety remaining, except for where the defects actually affect fire safety, like what you've seen with separation. But bringing it all back in, I think what we're going to see moving forward is a better standard and a better quality of building, because these issues have been brought to light. We've put in place at CHU a specialist underwriting team just to deal with these cladding risks and these defect risks, because they really, as you've sort of mentioned with the cladding, you can't just look at one building and apply a one size fits all. It really does need to be quite specific and quite bespoke, and you can't just assume because you've seen something before that this one's going to be like that. And especially with the defects, they're weird and wonderful, and we do appreciate, I can see we've still got 890 people on this call. People have worked with us through these issues, and we're just wanting to keep them insured. That's the main thing, right? We've got a mandatory obligation to insure these buildings. Let's work together to keep everyone insured.
Yeah. Well said.
Sorry.
I was going to say we've actually run out of time. I want to give a special thank you to both Dan and Luke for their words of wisdom. Really appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedules to help present this with us. And as a final comment from CHU, I guess I'd like to say CHU will always try to work with what's best for the market we're in, and try to provide options wherever possible. And that includes working with statutory bodies such as CSV. That includes working with bodies like the ARPC when it comes to cyclones. So I just wanted to put that out there, because I think contrary to some public belief, it's an us versus them sort of thing, and it's not actually what happens behind the scenes. We do want to work together for solutions. Our underwriting guidelines will continue to review as we talk to experts. I'm actually flying down to Melbourne next month to meet a fire engineer to discuss certain materials and so on. So we will strive for consistency of process and application of premiums and excesses, and underwriting consistency. If you do believe you've experienced something which isn't consistent with what was said today, please call our BDMs and we'll do our best. We always try to do our best. Doesn't mean we're perfect, but we strive for consistency in process and try to work with our clients wherever possible. So thank you very much for everyone's time, and of course to Kim. I hope you have a good rest of the day.
Thank you, Steve, Dan and Luke.
Thank you.
Thanks, CHU.
Cheers.